My sister said it loud enough for the whole garden to hear. She was standing near the rose trellis my mother had spent weeks decorating, champagne glass raised, her new husband beside her with that easy smile he wore like a costume. "Let's be honest," Elodie said, tilting her head at me the way she always did when she wanted to wound without looking like she was trying. Serena always did have the simplest taste. Some women marry power. Some women marry what's left. There was soft laughter from the guests. Some of it was uncomfortable. Most of it was not. I sat at the table with my hands folded in my lap and looked at my husband, Rowan Ashford, the man everyone at that party had decided was a cautionary tale. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He reached under the white linen tablecloth and squeezed my hand once, slowly, and that was all. My sister smiled at me like she had won something. She didn't know yet that the man she had just publicly called poor had already made some very careful decisions about who in that room deserved to know the truth. I kept my face still and watched her enjoy herself. I had learned by then that patience was a kind of armor. My name is Serena Vale. I was 31 years old when all of this happened, and I had grown up in Newport, Rhode Island, in a family where money was never discussed but always felt. The way cold is felt through a wall even when no one opens a window. My parents, Philip and Constance Vale, came from old coastal families who had been passing the same mahogany furniture and the same quiet expectations down through the generations for so long that nobody thought to ask whether either still fit. My younger sister Elodie was 28 and had been beautiful and strategic since childhood. She learned early that charm opened doors faster than effort, and she had spent her whole life treating that lesson like a master key. I was different. I was quieter. I noticed things. I listened more than I talked, and asked questions that people sometimes found inconvenient. My mother called it stubbornness. My father called it impracticality. Elodie called it boring. They were all wrong. It was the thing that saved me. Growing up in that house meant growing up inside a quiet competition I had never agreed to enter. But I was in it anyway. And by the time I was old enough to understand the rules, the game was already well underway. There were two families that mattered that season and two men who came with them. The first was Rowan Ashford, 34 years old, heir to Ashford Maritime, the oldest and most respected shipping company on the East Coast. The Ashfords were not flashy people. Their wealth was generational, slow, and deep, the way old rivers are deep. They did not need to announce themselves because everyone already knew. The second man was Cedric Hollis, 32, heir to Hollis Capital, a private lending and investment firm that had made its name over 2 generations of very aggressive deal-making. Cedric was handsome in a polished, deliberate way. He wore good suits and gave good speeches and had a mother, Vivian Hollis, who spoke as though every person without 8 figures in the bank was on borrowed time. 2 families, 2 men, 2 Vale daughters. The matchmaking was so obvious, it was almost embarrassing. Elodie moved first, as she always did, because she had decided Rowan's family name was the heavier door, and she wanted to be the one to walk through it. I was quietly expected to accept Cedric. Nobody asked what either of us wanted. That was, as I look back now, the first serious mistake anyone made. It would not be the last. I want to be honest about when I first saw who Rowan actually was because it wasn't dramatic. It was small. We were at a charity rehearsal dinner, one of those stiff evenings where the food is always cold and the conversation always warmer than it needs to be. An elderly valet had parked a car near the far edge of the lot, and the engine had stalled. The man was crouched beside it in the drizzle, looking embarrassed and tired. I saw Rowan notice from across the terrace. He set down his drink, walked out into the rain without his jacket, and spent 10 minutes kneeling beside that valet, helping him restart the engine. Not loudly. Not in a way that drew attention. He just did it because the man needed help. Nobody else moved. Cedric had been standing 5 feet from me and watched the whole thing, without changing his expression. Rowan came back inside, shook the water from his sleeves, and rejoined the conversation as if nothing had happened. But I had been watching. Elodie had not. She was telling a story that ended with everyone laughing at the right moment. I made a note of what I had seen and kept it somewhere quiet inside myself, the way you keep things that might matter later. 3 weeks before the formal engagement season was supposed to begin, Ashford Maritime announced it was entering emergency financial restructuring. The headlines were not kind. Words like collapse and legacy in freefall appeared in the kinds of columns that existed specifically to comfort wealthy people who had avoided disaster by watching it happen to someone else. Investors connected to Ashford accounts began making quiet calls. Society whispered. My mother stopped mentioning Rowan at breakfast. My father began looking at spreadsheets more than usual. And Elodie, who had spent 3 months presenting herself to the Ashford family with the practiced patience of someone certain of the outcome, went pale for exactly 1 evening. Then she did what Elodie always did when the ground shifted beneath her. She became practical in the way that selfish people call survival. She said she could not build a future on a name that was sinking. She did not take a day to consider. She did not speak to anyone about it. By the following morning, she was wearing white to a private lunch with Cedric Hollis. She had made her decision cleanly and completely, and she simply had not bothered to inform anyone else who might be affected by it. Elodie did not apologize. She did not ask me how I felt or whether I had feelings for Cedric, which I did not, but that was beside the point. She simply announced at dinner one evening that Cedric had always been the more sensible match for her, and that she was confident I was mature enough to understand family optics. My mother set down her fork and looked at my father, and my father looked at the tablecloth, and nobody said anything that was true for about 4 minutes. Cedric went along with the arrangement because he was the kind of man who liked winning even when the prize had come available by accident. He reframed it quickly, to others and probably to himself, as having chosen Elodie first. Our parents supported the switch because Hollis Capital was still solid, and the Vale name could not afford to be attached to whatever Ashford Maritime was about to become. I sat at that dinner table and watched my future get rearranged by people who had not thought to ask if I was in the room. I had learned by then not to be surprised by that, but I had also learned to notice it. And I noticed everything. Rowan came to our house on a Tuesday evening to return Elodie's engagement ring. I remember the weather was sharp and clear, the kind of October evening that feels like a warning. He stood in the front hallway beneath our chandelier, holding a small velvet box, and he looked composed in a way that must have cost him something. Elodie refused to come downstairs. My mother sent our housekeeper to collect the ring, as if Rowan were a delivery driver rather than a man who had spent 3 months being considered part of our family. I was at the top of the stairs when I saw the housekeeper take the box from his hands and disappear back toward the kitchen. Rowan stood there alone in the hallway for a moment, and I don't know what made me do it, but I came downstairs. I walked across the marble floor and stopped in front of him and said, "You deserve better than this." He looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "So do you." I stood there after he left and thought about those 3 words for a while. They were the most honest thing anyone in that house had said in months. 2 days later, Rowan asked to speak with me privately. We walked in the garden behind our house, which was bare and brown in the autumn cold, and he was careful and direct in a way I had not expected. He told me he would understand completely if I wanted nothing further to do with the Ashford name. He said it without self-pity, without making me feel guilty for listening. Then he said something I still remember exactly, word for word. "I don't need a wife who believes in money. I need someone who recognizes character when the money gets quiet." It was the kind of sentence that sounds simple until you sit with it. I laughed a little because it sounded like both a proposal and a warning at the same time. He smiled and said, "Maybe it is." I should have walked away. Any reasonable person would say I should have walked away. Instead, I asked him what kind of life we would actually have if the bankruptcy turned out to be real. It was not a romantic question. It was a practical one. I needed to know if he would tell me the truth when the truth was not flattering. He answered honestly. He said, "Smaller house, fewer parties, real work instead of appearances, and a future built slowly without pretending the fall hadn't hurt." He did not promise me it would be fine. He did not dress the situation up in words that would sound better than they felt. I had spent my whole life surrounded by people who decorated the truth before presenting it, and here was a man standing in a bare autumn garden simply handing it to me unwrapped. I believed him, not because I thought struggle was romantic. I am not that kind of person. I believed him because the thing I had been missing most was someone who told me the truth without calculating whether I could handle it. When I told my parents I would marry Rowan, my mother sat down in her chair slowly, like the chair had moved beneath her. My father said I was making an embarrassment of the Vale name. Elodie, who was sitting at the window with her tea, smiled the smile she used when she thought she already knew how a story was going to end. Let her, she said. Some people need to learn through suffering. I noted the smile. I filed it away. Our wedding was moved from the cathedral downtown to a small, old chapel near the water. The guest list shrank by half when the Ashford bankruptcy news became more public. The flowers were simpler, white and pale green, nothing imported, nothing that needed to be announced. The press barely covered it. 3 journalists who had been invited to the larger ceremony quietly declined when they heard about the change. Elodie arrived 20 minutes late in a silver dress that was close enough to white to be intentional, and she moved through the smaller space with the careful energy of someone who is trying to fill a room with their own significance. She whispered to my bridesmaids, loudly enough that I had married a sinking ship. Rowan was standing at the altar when she said it. I saw from his face that he heard her. He said nothing. He looked at the front of the chapel, then at me when I reached him, and when he slid his hand into mine, his palm was steady and warm and sure. For the first time in a long time, I felt like something had been chosen rather than assigned. That mattered more than the flowers. Elodie married Cedric Hollis 1 week after our wedding, and it was the kind of event designed to make people forget something uncomfortable had recently happened. Orchids flown in from Singapore. Crystal chandeliers in a ballroom that held 400 people. A 12-piece orchestra, and a guest list built from the kind of names that made other names feel smaller by comparison. I sat near the back with Rowan and said very little to anyone around us. During her toast, Elodie looked across the crowded room and said she was grateful to have married a man whose future was secure. Every person who mattered understood the direction of that sentence. I looked at Rowan. He was looking at his water glass. Something moved across his expression. A thought, a calculation, something carefully restrained, and then it was gone. He looked up and caught me watching him, and he gave me a small, quiet smile. I did not know yet what he knew. I would not know for several more months. But that look, the one he gave his water glass before catching himself, stayed with me like a question I hadn't yet found the right words for. Life after the wedding was not what people expected, and some of them said so. We lived in a modest coastal house held in trust by one of the older Ashford family properties, comfortable, well-kept, but nothing that matched what people assumed an Ashford home should look like. Rowan drove himself. He cooked on Sunday evenings. He worked long hours in a small study full of ledgers, shipping maps, and stacked folders with tabs I wasn't invited to sort. People assumed he was trying to manage whatever scraps remained of a failing inheritance. I assumed the same, at first. I was at the house most days with my work. I was an independent housing consultant, and I noticed things I could not fully explain. Phone calls where the voice on the other end sounded not desperate, but respectful. Documents delivered by courier in the early morning, signed for at the door, and carried immediately into the study. Quiet visitors, 2 or 3 times a month, men in plain clothes who arrived after dinner and left before midnight. I did not ask. I watched. And I added what I saw to the collection of quiet things I was keeping, waiting to understand. 3 months into Elodie's marriage, the mood in her world began to change in small ways I could only see because I was paying attention. She still posted photographs in the kind of clothing that requires a car service. But in person, she became focused on our finances in a way she had never been before. She would visit and walk through the small rooms of our coastal house with a kind of searching look, and she always worked around the same question, whether Rowan had found real work yet. Her interest felt less like cruelty by then, and more like something unsteady looking for a handhold. Cedric's mother Vivian had stopped hosting her monthly lunches, which was the kind of detail that meant nothing to most people but meant a great deal to anyone who understood how those social structures worked. Hollis Capital had delayed a distribution to outside investors, citing regulatory review. That was public information, but quietly public, the kind of item that appeared in small print and moved quickly past the eye unless you were looking. I was looking. The marriage Elodie had taken from me was not as solid as she had made it appear. I let that sit with me for a while and said nothing. The night everything changed, it was raining hard. Rowan came home later than usual, and after dinner, he closed the door to the study, sat across from me at the small table inside, and placed a sealed envelope between us. He was very still. He watched me look at it without speaking. "Open it," he said. Inside was a document package, 40-some pages, organized and tabbed. It took me the better part of an hour to understand what I was reading. Ashford Maritime's bankruptcy had not been a collapse. It had been a controlled restructuring, planned, deliberate, and executed with extraordinary precision. Rowan's grandfather had built a succession test into the family structure decades earlier, after watching too many people attach themselves to Ashford wealth and disappear the moment it became less convenient. The restructuring was designed to look like ruin, to move assets into protected positions while the public believed the company was gone, to see who stayed when the name no longer offered anything obvious in return. I set the last page down and looked at my husband. "Elodie failed the test," I said. It was not a question. He nodded slowly. Before anyone asked her one. There was more. The restructuring had been designed not only to test loyalty, but to expose something specific: families who had been circling Ashford Maritime's assets with bad intentions. The plan had created visible vulnerabilities that were watched carefully. Every approach, every offer, every back-channel inquiry from families who thought the Ashfords were desperate, all of it was recorded and tracked. Hollis Capital had been one of them. Cedric's family had tried to acquire distressed Ashford assets through intermediaries while maintaining the public appearance of sympathy and friendship. They had believed Rowan was a young man in over his head, grateful for any offer. They had been badly wrong. Rowan had been cataloging every approach for 2 years, building a picture of exactly who had come calling when they thought the family had no defense left. My sister had not simply chosen money. She had chosen the family that had been quietly working against mine. I let that settle into my understanding slowly. It changed several things I thought I knew about the shape of last year. I looked at Rowan across the table. "Did you know she would?" I asked. "No," he said. I only knew she could. I had one more question. I needed to ask it, even though part of me was afraid of the answer. I asked Rowan whether I had been part of the test, too. Whether any of what had happened between us had been calculated. The question came out with an edge I hadn't planned. He looked at me for a moment, and I could see that it had landed somewhere real. He didn't answer quickly. He said, "At first, I wondered what you would do. The situation gave everyone a reason to leave. I paid attention to what you did instead." He paused. "Then I watched you come down the stairs in your parents' house when nobody asked you to. I watched you say something true when it cost you social comfort to say it. After that, it stopped being a test." I wanted to believe him completely and immediately. I mostly did. But I also understood, because I was being honest with myself, that my marriage had begun inside a storm I had not fully understood while I was standing in it. That was something I needed to sit with. So I sat with it. And I kept sitting with it until it became something I could carry without it changing my balance. Elodie came to visit on a Wednesday morning, unannounced, wearing a cream cashmere coat and the particular expression she used when she was dressed for pity but had come to deliver it. She walked through our living room slowly, touching the back of the sofa, running a finger along the bookshelf, taking in everything that was smaller than what she had. "Serena," she said, turning to face me with something soft arranged around her mouth, "you don't have to pretend you're happy here. It's all right to admit things haven't turned out the way you hoped." I was standing in my kitchen doorway. Behind me, on the stove, was the tea Rowan had made before he left for the morning. On the windowsill was the small plant I had been keeping alive for 2 years. The rain was gentle against the glass. I looked at my sister and felt something settle into place inside my chest, warm and completely still. "Elodie," I said, "I didn't lose Cedric. You took him." She opened her mouth and then closed it. That was the first time in my life I saw my sister at a loss for what to say next. I turned back to my tea and let the silence be hers to manage. 2 weeks after Elodie's visit, on a gray Thursday afternoon, a car pulled up to our house that I didn't recognize. It was not driven by a chauffeur. The driver was Cedric Hollis. He came to the door in yesterday's suit, which on Cedric was a visible statement of distress. The man had never worn the same suit twice without it being freshly pressed. I opened the door. He asked if Rowan was home. Rowan came to the hallway, and Cedric looked at him with the expression of a man who had rehearsed for a moment and found that the rehearsal did not help as much as he'd hoped. I moved into the garden room and sat near the window. I did not mean to listen, but the walls were thin, and the afternoon was quiet. I heard Cedric say, "I know this is not a comfortable conversation, but I need work. Advisory operations, something discreet. I would appreciate discretion." There was a pause. Rowan did not sound surprised. He did not sound pleased either. He sounded like a man who had known this conversation was coming and had already decided what he was going to say. Cedric Hollis, the rich husband my sister had taken, was asking my poor husband for a job. Elodie called 40 minutes later. She asked, very directly, whether Cedric was at her house. I told her yes. There was a silence on the line that was different from her usual silences. Her usual silences were controlled, deliberate spaces she created to let other people feel uncertain. This one was something else. This one had an uneven edge to it. Then she laughed, or produced the sound she used instead of laughing when things were not funny. "Doing charity now," she said. I looked through the garden room window at Cedric sitting across from Rowan at the study table, his shoulders curved inward and his hands flat on the surface in front of him. "No," I said. "He came for employment." There was another silence. Then the line ended. She had hung up without saying anything else. I set down my phone and stayed at the window for a while. I was not glad about what I was seeing. That is the truth. I did not feel triumphant watching Cedric sit there with his hands flat and his pride somewhere below the table. I felt something quieter. The particular stillness that arrives after a long thing is finally over. Rowan offered Cedric a position. It was not what Cedric had come hoping for. It was not executive. There was no title that looked well on a business card or traveled nicely through a room. It was a compliance role, temporary, modest, carried out under strict oversight, and tied directly to a condition: full disclosure of every communication, approach, and back-channel negotiation Hollis Capital had conducted in relation to Ashford Maritime's restructuring period. Cedric's hands had been flat on the table when Rowan explained the terms. When Rowan finished, Cedric picked them up and put them in his lap. He did not argue. He did not try to renegotiate. He accepted because, as I came to understand in the following weeks, he had no better option available to him. Hollis Capital was under regulatory scrutiny, its distributions frozen, its reputation fraying at several visible edges. Cedric had arrived at our door not because Rowan was a soft target, but because Rowan was the only person he knew who might deal with him honestly. That was its own quiet statement about the life Cedric had built. Rowan was not being cruel. He was making a consequence fit the action. That was the first time I understood what it looked like when real power had nothing to prove. My parents hosted their anniversary dinner 6 weeks later. It was the kind of formal evening that required pressed table linens and the good china that only appeared when the family needed to perform wellness on each other. Elodie arrived in silk. Cedric arrived beside her in a suit that fit correctly again, though his face carried something subdued that the suit couldn't fix. I sat across from Rowan. The meal moved through its courses, and then near the end, over dessert, Elodie picked up her wine glass. She looked at me with the brightness she used when preparing to wound. "To Serena," she said, "who showed us all that love is blind enough to survive even a bankruptcy." She let the words sit there. She was smiling. Then, into the pause she had created, Cedric lowered his fork against his plate and said, "Elodie, stop." The room went still. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at Rowan and then at me, and quietly admitted he had been working under Ashford Maritime's oversight for several weeks. He said it plainly, without softening it. Elodie's face did not fall all at once. It changed slowly, the way something does when it understands it has run out of ground. The financial news came out the following morning. Ashford Maritime had completed its restructuring and emerged from the process considerably stronger than it had entered. Core assets had been fully and carefully preserved. Outstanding debt had been fully eliminated. Strategic partners who had been given access during the restructuring under false pretenses had been formally removed and, in several cases, reported to relevant regulatory bodies. Rowan was named executive chairman. The announcement ran in 3 national financial publications before 10 in the morning. I read it at the kitchen table with my coffee. Rowan was already on a call in the study. By noon, my father had called. His voice was careful and stiff, like a man walking across ice he was not certain would hold him. He said some things that amounted to an apology, without ever using the word. My mother called an hour later and asked whether Rowan and I might come to dinner later in the week. I told her we already had plans. We did not. But some things need a measured distance before they are welcome back in, and I was the only one in a position to set that distance on my own behalf. A month after the announcement, Rowan and I attended a private reception hosted by the Ashford board. It was a small event held at the older Ashford estate outside the city, the kind of gathering that did not require performance, only presence. I was nervous in a way I had not expected to be. These were people who had watched the restructuring from the inside. People who knew everything. At some point during the evening, Rowan's grandmother, Beatrice Ashford, found me near the window. She was 81 years old, small and very upright, and she took my hands in both of hers with the grip of someone who had spent 8 decades deciding exactly how much weight to give everything. "We don't reward women for marrying poor men," she said. "We reward people who understand the difference between a person and a price." Then she announced to the small group nearby that I would be joining the leadership of the Ashford Foundation's Family Housing Initiative, overseeing their community development program on the coast. Elodie had wanted a throne. I had been handed responsibility and the genuine respect of people who did not give it carelessly. I held Beatrice's hands and felt something close to gratitude. 6 months after the announcement, Elodie came to our house in the rain. She did not call first. She knocked, and when I opened the door, she was under a small umbrella doing little against the wind, looking tired in a way she had never let herself look in front of me. Her marriage was collapsing under the combined weight of financial strain, public embarrassment, and the specific resentment that grew between 2 people who chose each other for reasons that have since evaporated. She came inside and sat at my kitchen table and wrapped her hands around the tea I made her. She did not apologize at first. She asked if Rowan could speak to someone about Cedric's position, perhaps move him somewhere more prominent, help them recover socially. She was still framing rescue as something power owed her. I looked at my sister across the table. She was still beautiful. She was also afraid and not hiding it well. "I can forgive you," I told her. "I will eventually, but I won't rebuild your life at the cost of the truth. That's not something I'm able to do." She looked at her tea. She did not argue. That was the closest she had come to real honesty with me. A year after our wedding, Rowan and I hosted a dinner at our coastal home. Not a large one. Just the people who had stayed honest through a year that tested what honesty actually cost. Cedric was rebuilding slowly in a role that required genuine work rather than inherited position. Elodie was living in a smaller apartment, adjusting to a version of life she had never prepared herself for. My parents were learning, carefully, how to respect what they had not chosen. And me, I was the woman who had been told she married beneath herself. I was the woman who sat at a garden reception while her sister made a joke out of her husband and her choice, and who had smiled and stayed calm because she had learned that some things correct themselves if you are patient enough to let them. I had not gone looking for vindication. I had gone looking for a life that was honest, and I had found one. My sister had told everyone I married beneath us. Then her rich husband came to our door asking mine for a job. And that was the day the whole family finally understood that I had not married down at all. I had married deeper. And the ground under my feet had never once moved.